9 chapters, and there's a discussion that's going online right now about whether or not the Cold War was inevitable, given the factors of the two powers, the strategic interests of both the United States and the Soviet Union, and finally the ideologies that were being played out, whether or not the Cold War was inevitable, because the term Cold War itself is used to specifically describe this time period, but it is also the most visible and most modern-day example of two competing powers that cannot go to war with each other conventionally. Okay? They have neither the military capability of overpowering the other, nor do they have the wherewithal to effectively make this a quick and decisive war. The memories of the Second World War certainly played their parts in how the Cold War was being waged. The other understanding is that you do not go up against a power that has nuclear weapons. You do not go up against a power that may actually use nuclear weapons given extreme circumstances. The thought of a nuclear disaster was effectively a self-imposed deterrent. So the idea that the Soviet Union and the United States were constantly threatening each other and competing ideologically, and they were fighting a number of proxy wars in the developing world, the fact remains that during the 45-year period, not a shot was fired by an American soldier towards a Russian, and vice versa. And the other paradoxical thing about that is that Europe, which is where most of the armaments, the military materials, and most of the politics were handled, Europe, just by proxy, becomes the most peaceful. Europe becomes the most pacified. It's not, I should emphasize, not so much peaceful, but stable. A realist would look at this and say, peaceful may be stable, not vice versa. And the only time that we see a resumption of violence in Europe is after the Cold War, with the breakup of Yugoslavia and the civil wars that ensued. There was absolutely no fighting between the two sides. And that may have had more to do with just simply nuclear weapons, but the idea that the thought of two major superpowers with their allies going to war with each other would have resulted in World War III, which, to kind of paraphrase, I think it was Einstein who said this, he said, I'm not exactly sure how World War III will end or how it will be fought, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. Okay? So the idea that a catastrophic nuclear holocaust was right around the corner was laid bare in the early 1960s with the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, reviewing what we were looking at last Wednesday and picking up from a lot of these points moving forward today, right? It's worth repeating again. The Cold War was a bipolar system of power that was divided along strategic interests, ideological outlook, and perceptions of national security. So you can look at the Cold War from both a realist, a liberalist, and a constructivist point of view. In fact, it may even be worth pursuing this for either your second research evaluation or for your final research paper as to which theoretical approach gives you probably the best insight into how the Cold War and other international relations have been waged over the past 40 to 50, 60, 70 years. The thing to note here is that strategic interest is clearly a realist point of view. Ideological outlook, definitely liberalist, and perceptions of national security is certainly constructivist. Now, the one thing that we can certainly take away, this is more empirically historical than interpretively, is how both the United States and the Soviet Union pursued said foreign policy. The United States practiced its hegemony via commercial pacifism and democratic peace theory, at least as far as Europe and North America was concerned. Right? That's pretty much beyond arguments. The United States pursued a type of integrative, inclusive hegemony with its major partners in Western Europe and North America. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, operated its hegemonic position more through traditional forms of political control. And that is making sure that there are compliant/puppet communist regimes throughout Eastern Europe and Central Europe. And of course, both countries having nuclear capabilities just sealed the deal that any type of conflict between both sides would result in mutually assured destruction. This is the term that was used to describe a military conflict between these two powers, because neither country had the capability of knocking out the other country in one strike. Mutually assured destruction meant that the other country, whichever one was going to be receiving the nuclear weapons first, had at least one chance of striking back. So the United States could not knock the Soviet Union out in one nuclear launch. The Soviet Union could not do the same with the United States, which meant that there would at least be one more round where a country could launch its own nuclear missiles and create a catastrophic situation, not only between those two countries, but among its various allies. So mutually assured destruction was certainly a way of maybe not preserving peace, but definitely ensuring stability. Now, with all of that in mind, I think it's also worth pointing out that strategic interests can only take us so far as realists can do. I think, and at least this is being partially soapbox, you are free to agree, disagree, however way that you want, but looking back on the Cold War, 25 years and more into the past, I think it is certainly worth investigating that it wasn't a war of military, it was certainly a war of ideology. It was certainly a war of ideology, at least in terms of getting second-rate and even third-rate powers to ally one side or the other. The United States was pushing the idea that the U.S. stood for freedom, democracy, liberty, independence, development, all that kind of stuff. And they used Western Europe as the glossy photos for the brochure. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, changed its tactics, noticeably after Stalin had died. Stalin was an old-school military, sort of medieval warlord who just simply used all of his allies as buffer zones. But the Soviet Union, from Khrushchev on, saw that communism could be a very lucrative ideology for countries emerging from the periphery, to use Wallerstein's model of world systems theory, particularly countries emerging from colonial holdings from Western Europe. And this becomes even all the more apparent from the mid-60s throughout the 70s. By the 1980s, that ideology morphs into competing economic models. By the 1980s, the United States realizes that it can win the war of ideology by money, by pop culture, by what we refer to as soft power. Now, this is something that realists are going to overlook. This is something that liberalists are going to give some kind of passing reference to, but this is something that constructivists go nuts over. Okay? Constructivists will definitely say that, if anything, the United States won the war not so much by outspending the Soviet Union, but that by the 1980s, the United States looked simply more appealing. The United States had a number of things in its pop cultural arsenal that were much more appealing to those in the East looking West than to those in the West looking East. So there's a lot of ways in which we can look at the second half of the Cold War, particularly in relation to either of one of the two superpowers and how it is responding to another country. And I'm going to be using Wallerstein's world systems theory model throughout the lecture today to kind of give you this understanding about how these countries relate to their cores, to their core allies, as well as to their peripheries. The first thing to understand, okay? First thing to understand here is that the United States had different foreign policies, depending upon where it was focused. As far as Western Europe and North America was concerned, this was the heart and soul of America's transatlantic economic cooperation. That much is painfully obvious. To the developing world, on the other hand, the United States still assumed this position of superiority, which was already codified in a previous document known as the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine already places the United States in a position above its developing neighbors, particularly Latin and Central America. The Truman Doctrine, which is a more recent additive to the whole scenario, implies that the United States is going to weigh Wilsonian realism to those countries that wish for U.S. protection. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, is going to answer that notable hierarchical support and start egging on a number of these developing countries in the periphery to consider communism as a better alternative to market capitalism, simply because communism, at least in theory, allows these developing countries to use their own raw materials and natural resources for their own benefit. Under a US-supported system, the United States and other corporate countries are simply going to extract these raw materials for their own industrial benefit, as well as look at these countries as little more than compliant states. And this we see most notably in the proxy areas of Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. So the only areas that become somewhat off limits, okay, is Europe, both Western and Eastern, simply because of the military presence. We also have to take a few moments to note that communism did have some early successes. Countries opting to go the communist route were countries that had some industrial capability well before the market economy kicked in. One very notable example, this is one of the very few times that we will speak positively about these people, North Korea. Okay? Without laughing. Okay? No, trust me, North Korea is hilarious, trust me. Okay? But the thing is that North Korea really was the better Korea up until, I would say, the late 70s, early 80s. It was, if you kind of think back to the Korea, sort of the United Korean Peninsula, the northern tip was where the Japanese occupying powers got most of their raw materials, most of their industrial capacities, most of the intelligentsia was located in what would become North Korea. South Korea was very agricultural, very rural, very backward. Very different today. But North Korea, under Kim Il-sung, was noted to be more of a showpiece than a blooper reel. And we see this in a number of other emerging countries, particularly in Central Africa as well. Countries that had opted for the communist model opted so because it was the better option to develop their own social, economic, and cultural resources. There's a type of national communism that we can even go into say. This is more the Chinese model than the Soviets. The Soviets kind of played into this only because it gave them allies, but the Chinese model under Mao was really the global standard by which we could consider national communism or national socialism, even though national socialism as a term means something completely else. It means Nazis goose-stepping into another country. But the Chinese version of communism was certainly a marketable model for a couple of reasons. Number one, China's version of communism already assumed that the vast majority of peasants in the rural developing areas never really bothered to sit down and read Marx. And let's be honest, Marx wrote a lot of stuff. Marx isn't exactly the most easy read to make, right? You've got the Communist Manifesto, which is a little, back pocket thing to leaf through during your labor strikes. But Marxism basically implies that the workers are going to be already somewhat educated, somewhat skilled, and somewhat politically active. The Chinese version of communism goes even further than the Soviet version. The Soviet version is basically, well, people are not educated, give communism to peasants, it works, let's see what gets, right? In China, on the other hand, they're like, yeah, we totally get that. We totally get that. But in this case, communism is more of a national liberation movement, not a class-based movement, not a movement that will destroy the state, but a movement that will prevent other powers from exploiting said state. Let me repeat that again so everybody's on the same page here. This notion of national communism was not in favor of eliminating the state along Marxist theories, but more as a way of giving hegemonic power to a core group of elites, whether it's Mao Zedong in China, or Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, or Fidel Castro in Cuba, or Che Guevara, wherever they would give him a place to crash for the night, or whatever it was, In this regard, communism becomes more of a national liberation struggle. And it takes this on very, very visibly, both in Southeast Asia, as we see in Vietnam, Cambodia, and other places, and even more so Latin America, where communism in this case is almost synonymous with anti-colonialism. And if anti-colonialism works in South America, it is also very, very critical of US economics. Okay? So in this regard, the Soviets may have found their ace in the hole by exploiting along a Marxian axiom the frustrations of the periphery, the rage against the core. Okay? That's something to keep into account. This is where the war of ideology really heated up. And more importantly, if we accept this hypothesis, it adds to the general understanding about why the United States made a number of corners, cut a number of corners in its foreign policy that kind of did away with supporting democracies and did more towards supporting compliant pro-Western regimes. This should be a little bit more clear as the lecture goes on. All right, so we've talked about the periphery. Let's then talk about the core. And here I want to just qualify. I'm not using Wallerstein's core model exclusively, which denotes developed industrialized states. What I'm doing here is taking the notion of the core as the primary states within an alliance system, but also noting which countries were key allies of either Washington or Moscow. And I made that apparent in the lecture on Wednesday, which ones were, key partners in this matter. The first thing to understand about the United States, and this goes back to where I was just talking about not too long ago. In this situation, the United States plays the liberalist card. U.S. foreign policy is certainly pronounced by patterns of commercial pacifism and by patterns of democratic transition theory. Okay? America's transatlantic relationship, specifically Great Britain, Canada, France, West Germany, the Low Countries, Belgium, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Italy, Spain when Franco finally died. But trust me, the United States did not isolate Spain under Franco either. The United States saw that the North Atlantic was a key strategic area, not just for military capabilities, but also for rebuilding and maintaining a healthy trans-economic cooperative. This is basically the rudimentary foundations of the global free market today. And that's why I said Adam Smith tends to be more of the victor at the end of the Cold War than Thomas Jefferson. The other thing that we have to understand is, and I will give complete deference to the realists on this sense, is that this transatlantic cooperation took place amid a larger framework of military security, specifically through NATO. Now, NATO is one of the most successful international organizations in modern history. Full stop. NATO is successful simply because of its limited and strategic objectives, and that is simply to provide collective military security. What it also implies is that the United States has been, and as long as this thing continues, pretty much will be the military hegemon within that alliance. That's not saying that the United States is trying to exploit others. What it does say is this: the United States, through NATO, tells its allies, don't worry about military spending. Traditionally, states need to allocate a certain percentage of their revenue every year towards military spending, towards security. The United States effectively said, in so many words, you can spend whatever money that you want on your own defense force, but we're going to be the primary military in Europe. If there's a war, blow a whistle, and one of our staff sergeants will hear it and will come running. Now, what does that do? Two unbelievably beneficial things. Number one, the notion that another country has effectively blank-checked your security means that you can focus your time, energy, and resources on other things: economic, cultural, institutional. The second thing, and this is a bit more microeconomic, is that let's just take a country like Germany. The United States told the West German governments after it was reformed in 1949, 1950, again, in so many words, guys, look, every time we give you an army, you do something stupid with it. Okay? Every time you get an army, every time you get a little crazy with your army, a world war breaks out. So here's the peace agreements. we're going to rebuild your country. We're going to provide you security. You're going to have a military that's a little bit more of a token defensive force. 100, 150,000, that's about it, okay? No armored brigades, no major air force. Oh, and here's the other thing. You can't send your army into another country for obvious reasons, right? We understand the side, you know, type of thing, right? But here's the thing. In return, the West German government does not have to invest its necessary funds for military spending, which means that its economic investment is doubled. The amount of money that would go into economic investment, there. The money that would traditionally go to a military, oh, we don't have to do that. Okay? There's a double investment in the economy. This is the reason why the European economic system, particularly in the West, picks up so quickly. This is the reason why the German economy picks up so quickly. By the mid-1950s, everyone was talking about the German economic miracle. Yes, Germans are efficient. Yes, German products are good. We also have to take into account Germany is not investing in a major military. So a realist argument could be, once you have that all-encompassing security, once you have effectively pacified the region with a superior military, and everyone within that military alliance chooses to play by the rules and acknowledge the United States as the alpha in the pack, then, and only then, can you spend time really developing your economy and developing transnational institutional links. In other words, commercial pacifism and democratic peace theory can work. But it can work even better if all sides know that there is no threat of invasion, that there is no threat of war. Hence the reason why the French and the Germans got along so marvelously well after the Second World War. Why? Because the United States is basically playing chaperone. So the thing to take away here is that security assurances through NATO give us the opportunity to develop mutually dependent economic relations under what historians and economists would know as the Bretton Woods Agreement. The Bretton Woods Agreement, which comes out in 1944, is basically the foundation of what would be America's transatlantic economic free trade zone. And out of these wonderful things in Europe, the Marshall Plan is the first thing that helps to rebuild, refund, and revitalize Europe. Again, economically speaking, it pays to pump money into your major allies so their economy can be top-notch. Otherwise, the United States is going to be footing the bill for a very, very long time. Okay? And the second one, and the one that really develops into the European Union today, is that environment creates the condition for the Schuman Plan, which effectively establishes the European Coal and Steel Commission, which, as we know today, is now the modern-day European Union. In other words, NATO should be given a significant degree of credit for providing for the foundations of modern transnational global trade. Security gives you the ability to think about other stuff. When you don't have security, all that you're doing is thinking about getting security. Does all make sense? Not that difficult. On the opposite side of the wall, in the Soviet sphere, there was less this type of inclusive cooperation and more a type of top-down control. Stalin basically sought to control everything through good old-fashioned hegemony. People after Stalin came up with a better idea. It's a bit more cost-effective, but it doesn't do anything in the long run. It is basically ensuring compliance and partnership through a series of bureaucratically authoritarian alliances. And we see that there's at least one uprising in every Soviet satellite of Eastern Europe. East Germany, 1953, Hungary, 1956, Czechoslovakia, 1969, Poland, 1981. And in each of these uprisings, either the Red Army comes in, quashes the would-be revolution, or it's an internal coup to avoid the Red Army coming in, but the results are the same. An ensuing bureaucratic authoritarian regime that basically tries to keep the Soviets happy and keep these old guards, these old bureaucratic people in control, remains this way until 1989. Eastern Europe basically kind of atrophies and just sort of stays in this bubble. until the late 80s. It's around the world, on the other hand, that people see the march of communism. China, 1949. North Korea, 1953. Vietnam, with the first visible military victory of a native population against a colonial power. The Ho Chi Minh's victory at Dien Bien Phu in 1954 effectively ended French colonial rule. And of course, it began the long and very drawn-out, painful relationship that the United States had with Southeast Asia, where the French do one final thing on their way out. They phone up America and they say, can you bail us out? Can you take care of this little problem in Indochina? Okay, which would come back to haunt them about 20 years later. And of course, Cuba, 1959. Castro comes to power, New Year's Day. Take that. And then, the final thing, Afghanistan, 1981. So the notion that communism is kind of moving around the world puts the United States into a far more defensive position as well. It can be open, it can be inclusive in one part of the world, the transatlantic area, because that's the one place the Soviet Union is not screwing with. The developing world, the United States loses patience faster and faster for countries democratizing and begins to opt for the quicker solution of simply extending its control in the developing world before the Soviets get to us.